I got into this work because my son died 20 years ago when he was 16 from a rare metabolic disorder. So I had the experience of caregiving. I had the experience of, unbearable pain and loss. And maybe that definitely, taught me about resilience and a whole lot of stuff. So I have that in me. And it's easy for me to walk in this space.
Mm.
So, but of course, there are times when I'm crushed by what I see and experience. When I'm with people dying, when I see somebody die, it doesn't upset me at all. But the minute I turn around and I look at the crying wife, I cry.
What if the best chapter of your life hasn't even begun yet? What lies within you is the power to live brighter, bolder, and truer than ever before. So welcome to Vivatude, where caregiving, connections, and career come into balance, and where your vitality, vision, and voice shines through. Because the revolution isn't out there, it's already within you. Welcome to Vivatude.
Welcome back to Vivatude. I'm Lauren Archer, and in this series, we talk about the pillars of wellness. And one of the things that, especially women in midlife who are busy caring for others, trying to manage career, perhaps kids at home, parents, even spouses that are dealing with health issues, we find ourselves caring for everyone else. And in this series, we talk about how to restore your own energy and care for yourself. Well, today I have a very special guest. It's Dr. Terri Daniel, and we are going to talk about something that everyone comes in contact with at one point or another, and that is grief. Whether we lose a loved one due to illness or injury, whether it's a relationship that ends up passing, grief is something that we all wrestle with at one point or another. And Dr. Daniel's work is very vast. I'm going to invite her to introduce herself. And today we're going to talk about some myths and misperceptions about those stages of grief that we've all heard about. And there is some new information that maybe you don't know. So, Dr. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us. Please tell us a little bit about yourself and your organization and the work that you do.
Hi, thank you for having me. And I do so many different things. Basically, I am a hospice grief counselor. I'm also a college teacher, and I teach in a death studies program. So in that program, I teach everything about end of life care and bereavement. Grief is a very big part of that. I also teach in a an interfaith chaplaincy program at two seminaries. And when I say chaplaincy and seminary, your mind is already going to religion, and I'm going to tell you don't go there because this is non-religious. Your hospice chaplain, your hospital chaplain. Um, is not supposed to come at you with religion if it's done properly. Chaplains are actually supposed to be religiously neutral, unless you request religion specific type of encounter. We can talk about that later. So all of this is related to death and grief. And so that's my teaching and my counseling work. And I also do publishing and research work in grief theory and grief therapy and grief practices and everything really having to do with loss and grief. And Lauren, what we were talking about before is a lot of people don't know that we don't use the five stages of grief theory, and we haven't in 20 years. And it's so popular, everybody knows it. And I'm so glad I have the opportunity here today to talk everybody out of it.
I love it. Well, let's talk about that. What are the common beliefs now about what those five stages of grief are? What is it that most people are operating under the assumption of?
Well, let's go back to the beginning, which was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was a researcher. published in the 70s, basically, a book called On Death and Dying, which was a brilliant, incredible book. And she did research at a Swiss hospital. She interviewed 200 patients who had a terminal diagnosis. They were facing their own death. This had nothing to do with grief. And she asked them, how do you feel about dying? And she collected all their answers and their responses. So the key word that we're looking at here is response. Keep that in mind. And so if someone told you you had 3 months to live, you'd have all kinds of different feelings about it. And she sort of synthesized the five most common responses that these 200 people had. And those five most common responses turned out to be denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then eventually acceptance. And they kind of happened in stages. At least that's how her research was packaged.
Mhm.
And so she published this in this book called On Death and Dying. And she basically said, this is how dying people, at least the 200 that I interviewed, tend to respond to their death. And that was that. And it was great. And it was just about dying. And when you're given a terminal diagnosis, yeah, the first thing you're going to do is deny it. Well, no, I can't possibly have lung cancer. I never smoked. Or I can't possibly have, terminal kidney failure. I'm only 25. So that's denial.
Mhm.
And then anger, of course, very easy to understand. I'm not going to die. I'm 40. I've got young children. And then bargaining. Bargaining is I'm going to get a second opinion. Go to another doctor. I'm going to go to three doctors. That's a form of bargaining. Or you bargain with God.
Mhm.
Please, God, if you take this terrible thing away from me, I will volunteer and help the homeless or, do something. And then depression, that's iffy. We'll come back to that because depression is not the same as sadness. And then with a terminal diagnosis facing death, you will ultimately have to accept it and face it. So that's that. Let's put that over here. That's death.
Okay.
So in the 90s, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross meets a man named David Kessler at a conference. And he says, hey, I got this idea. Let's take your 5 stages of death and apply it to grief and make 5 stages of grief. And she says, okay. And they write a book called On Grief and Grieving.
Mm,
And he takes those 5 stages and applies them to grief. And they have a bestseller and they make a ton of money. And that's how it happened.
interesting.
And everybody said, oh, grief. Yeah. First we have denial, then we have anger, then we have bargaining and depression. And the grief researchers started to look at this and said, wait a minute, that is not what happens with grief at all. Makes sense over here with death, but not grief. So it started to get really studied. And over a period of time, it was like, no, here's a whole lot of reasons why this doesn't work. So that's the history. That brings us up to now, or up to the year about 2000, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I know grief as a process, it is not just one thing, and it affects everyone differently, and it brings so many people to proverbially to their knees. It can totally wipe out your rational linear mind's ability to cope because it is such an emotional hit energetically. So what can you share about the research and I would imagine you've got lots of insight in how to help people navigate through some of these challenging experiences.
Yeah, we have actual tools now. So I want to go back just a little bit into the research. So here's what we figured out about why the stages don't work. There's no evidence that people go through, a hierarchy of stages. First you do this, first you do, then you do that. And we can all look at our grief experience and say, yeah, it didn't really happen that way.
Mhm.
Um, there's no stage 1 through 5. Um, there's a stage theory like that ignores all this other stuff that happens in grief. Like there's a big difference if your 90-year-old mother dies or your 9-month-old child. There's like so much variation in that. You can't just put that into a neat little package. And then there's also, so many factors about you. How many losses have you had before this? What's your own psychological state of mind like? Are you prone to depression all your life? We can't just say that suddenly you're going to get clinical depression. What is your personal coping mechanisms like? What is your capacity for resilience? There's so many factors. So this stage theory just ignores everything about how you function as a person. It ignores your immediate environment. It ignores things like what kind of support, social support do you have to help you through the grief process? What is your cultural framework, your religious framework about loss? So those are the reasons why it doesn't work. And it also ignores um, the other responses. So, one of the things that's really flawed about some of the old ways of looking at grief is that there's this misconception we have that grief is always distressing and intense. And, for those of us who have lost elderly parents, especially elderly parents who have really suffered, people who've been in skilled nursing facilities, who've had dementia, who've had extreme illness, when they finally die, it is not distressing necessarily. Sometimes it's great relief.
Mm-hmm.
The distress is over. And so this idea that, grief is always this horrible, distressing, hand-wringing experience is a misconception. And so that's also not considered in this, common mythology about grief, is that grief is always bad, grief is always painful.
Yeah.
So going back to that word I said earlier, responses, there's a whole list of kinds of responses that we can have. And I can give you something if you want to post it in your show notes that people can read. But
Yes. It's
some responses can be positive, curiosity, like, wow, I wonder what happens when we die.
mm,
Or, optimism, like, wow, now that grandma's gone, caregiving is over. My life can come, I can get my life back now.
mhm.
There can be an increase in social engagement, a finding of new strength, an optimism, relief, um, all kinds of, a spiritual growth. On the other side of the spectrum, there can be spiritual anger, spiritual crisis, that your belief system, well, we prayed and we prayed that, he would get better, and he didn't get better and he died. And like, why didn't God listen to us? So there's that side of the spiritual piece. There can be guilt, and, you can go into regression. If you were, for example, an addict and now you have recovered, a traumatic loss can send you back into addiction. All of these are responses, which
Yeah.
is very different than stages.
And in your work, so that is first of all, that's refreshing because I think people might put themselves into a box, thinking, well, I'm supposed to have this kind of experience, and if they have something different, this would be refreshing news that there's a wide range of normal on how people respond to grief. In your work, I'm just curious, how do you work with people? And what advice might you give to someone who is moving through? Because what we're talking about, the death and dying, these are they're not talked about that much in our society, and that's what you do every day. So I'm just super curious about what's a day in the life like for you in hospice, counseling with the people dying themselves, counseling with family. What can you share?
You know, it's not as hard as people think it is. I mean, people say to me, like, how do you do this? How do you decompress? I don't know. It's just something, it doesn't put a lot of strain on me. I got into this work because my son died 20 years ago when he was 16 from a rare metabolic disorder. So I had the experience of caregiving. I had the experience of, unbearable pain and loss. And maybe that definitely, taught me about resilience and a whole lot of stuff. So I have that in me. And it's easy for me to walk in this space. So, but of course, there are times when I'm crushed by what I see and experience. When I'm with people dying, when I see somebody die, it doesn't upset me at all. But the minute I turn around and I look at the crying wife, I cry. That's what gets me. And I cry right along with them. I learned that years ago from a hospice nurse when I was so young and I was a volunteer. And I said, "Is it okay for me to cry?" And she said, "Absolutely. We cry right along with them." So I remembered that. And I don't know. I can talk to grieving people all day long and then, you know, just go about my life. I mean, I do have my decompression tools. I get up at 4 in the morning. I work up like a mad person all day long, but I have a little siesta in the middle of the day. I'm going to take a walk. I hang out with my dog. I have my little tools. I guess I don't even think about it as self-care, but I assume that it is. It's just
Mhm.
sort of natural.
I love it. What would you say to someone who is freshly in a situation, either teetering on the bridge of having a loved one getting ready to pass, or maybe shortly after that? What are some strategies that you offer? And what I heard you say earlier is there is no one thing, right? There's no one right way. But just in terms of, putting this in context with life, what can you share?
Well, I am a big believer in what I call occupational therapy for the soul. And that is rituals and ceremonies, things that you actually do. And I can send you some handouts if you want to share that with your audience. And I give these to people. So there are people sitting around the bedside. Even if you're just visiting a loved one at home or in the care facility or waiting for somebody to die, and you're just sitting. And, talking is important, but I like to give people activities to do. So, and I have a whole a list of things that you can do. So, for example, if you're a family sitting around and dad is dying, and assuming you're a family that likes each other and isn't fighting, there's processes you can do. Like you can, sit around and all share stories about happy memories that you have of dad. Or even more engaged is um, pass a little like notebook or piece of paper around and everybody write a little memory and just pass it around. So you have this little kind of like a little journal book.
Mhm.
And then everybody writes something and then passes it to the next person and the next person. And you're reading what the person before you wrote and you laugh and so on, all around the circle. You can do that for days. And then you have this funny little book and you can read it at the funeral or you can keep it or you can actually bury it with him or cremate it with him.
Mhm.
There's a process that we do. I actually did this with somebody who did Death with Dignity, and she wanted to have a ceremony. She invited all her friends. She was going to do the ingestion, we call it, taking the medicine. She was going to do it the next day, and she wanted a ceremony. And so she lived in a care facility. She had ALS, and they let her use a meeting room. So she had 30 people come. And we did this ceremony where everybody took a little ribbon like this.
Mhm.
And she was sitting there in her wheelchair. And one by one, her friends came up to her and they tied a ribbon around her wrist. And with the ribbon, they told a little story about their memories of her and how much they love her and all the memories. And so at the end of the ceremony, here she was with her two wrists with all these ribbons hanging off, with all the memories from all her loved ones.
Wow.
And she kept the ribbons on her wrist. The party was over. She went home. Her caregiver gave her a shower and she had all the ribbons. And the next morning, she ingested the medicine and she died. She had the ribbons on. She never took them off. Then she was cremated with the ribbons. So
Hmm.
she carried all this stuff with her into her death,
That's
into
beautiful.
the afterlife, whatever your belief system is.
Hmm.
So I give people things like that to do.
Ah,
Ritual, it's ritual therapy, it's ritual tools. I learned from a friend who did this. Her brother died from suicide, and she had to, I don't know if this was when she identified his body in the morgue or this was at some point, I don't know, she had access to his body and she took a Sharpie and she wrote on his body messages of love to him. She just wrote on his arms, on his chest, I love you. I'll always be with you, whatever. Just crazy, creative,
mhm,
imaginative things. And you can do this, to anybody at any time.
mhm.
When my mother was dying, I did a ceremony called a body. Well, she was already dead at that point. A body blessing, where as soon as she died, and everybody cleared out of the room because my family hates stuff like this. They think I'm weird and they're very uncomfortable with this sort of thing. And you know how people wash the body after death. I just took a little washcloth and it's just a little blessing where I just say, I bless your eyes for all they have seen in this life. I bless your mouth for the words of love you have spoken. I bless your heart for the love you have felt. I bless your breasts for the babies that you have fed. I bless your womb for the children you've given birth to. I bless your legs for the path you have walked, and so on down the body. I have tons of these rituals. So that answers your questions, like what people can do.
Yes, that is so valuable. And a ritual is it's like an outward manifestation of a concept, right? We get stuck in our mind with all these ideas, but when we actually do something in a ceremonial way, it's like it adds a dimension of depth and meaning that sounds super valuable. Well, Dr. Daniel, Terri, tell us how people can reach you and if they wanted to engage your services or learn more about your work or read your blog. You've got some great articles on your website. How can people find you?
The best way to find me is endwelladvisors.com. One word. I guess it's all one word if it's a website. Endwelladvisors.com. I also have another website that is deathgriefandbelief.com.
Okay.
And Well Advisors is, where I'm available for consulting. Death, Grief, and Belief is I produce symposiums and conferences, educational programs online, and we've got seminars and symposiums going on all the time. So both of those places will bring you all kinds of useful stuff.
I love it. We'll put that in the show notes. I have so much respect and admiration for the work you do. It's a meaningful part of life that in our society often gets kind of swept under the rug. So to have your perspective and someone like you by our side when we're moving through these life and death situations is of the utmost value. So thank you for taking the time to be with us today. Is there any closing remarks that you want to share?
I'm just so grateful to be in front of your audience, and I really appreciate how you understand the ritual piece. You said it beautifully. It's like ritual gives form to the formless, which
Mm,
is exactly what you said. So thank you for understanding that. That
mm.
means a lot.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us. And please check the show notes. If you've been part of our Vivatude audience, we would love to hear from you. Feel free to leave a comment. Let us know what resonated for you in this series. And until next time, may you live well and continue to shine that light in the world. Thank you.
And thanks for listening to Vivatude. 4 hosts, 1 each week. We help you revivitude your next chapter because purpose, passion, and prosperity isn't out there. They're already within you. Brighter, bolder, truer. Vivatude.